Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your latitude.
Senator Toomey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just add my thanks to you for having this hearing and pursuing this. As a former entrepreneur and with an experience in finance, both large and small institutions, I have long been convinced that the formation of capital and access to capital is perhaps the single biggest driver of economic growth and opportunity. So I think what we're doing here is very, very important. I've got three bills that address this in various ways, and they've been mentioned already. I want to thank Senator Tester for the great work that he's done and on the Reg A bill, which I am really quite optimistic about, given the very broad bipartisan support for that bill. Later today, I'll be unveiling with Senator Schumer a bill that he and I have that will facilitate IPOs, which I think is very constructive and I think will also have broad bipartisan support. But I'd like to start my question on a third bill, which is one that Senator Carper and I have introduced, which is the Private Company Flexibility and Growth Act. And we've had some discussion about this, and I'd like to start with Mr. Geisen, if I could. A couple of questions. In your testimony, I think you briefly alluded to a relationship between this bill and Wawa's ability to grow and create jobs. And I was wondering if you could just make that really clear to the committee, the connection between passage of this bill and Wawa's ability to grow, to expand, and to create new jobs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Toomey. Wawa's ability to grow since its inception in 1964 has not been hindered because the regulations at that point in time allowed us enough flexibility. However, today we've grown to a point where going forward, because being privately held is so critical to being successful over the long term and being able to share and focus more of our ownership with our employees. Therefore, going forward, the desire to remain private, the number of shareholders we have, we would be forced to redirect capital away from new stores, new growth, and job creation, dollar for dollar, right into reorganizing and restructuring our balance sheet and our capital ownership so that we could eliminate and reduce or restrict the number of shareholders we have to remain in compliance with this outdated law.
So it's fair to say then the passage of this bill and having it signed into law would directly result in a more rapid expansion and greater job growth at Wawa.
Yes, Senator, exactly. These are the same dollars that we are going to deploy and will deploy with more flexibility to building new stores in the 5 states we're in, as well as a new market, versus putting them to work to just stay in compliance.
Right. Does it make any difference to you guys whether the ceiling on the number of permissible shareholders is lifted by regulation, presumably by the SEC, or through legislation of Congress?
It does not. Either Congress or by rule of the SEC, the process to us, we are indifferent. The importance for us really is the timeline. We're at an inflection point. Several private companies that we're aware of are at an inflection point. And really, it's the timeline that's most important for us in order for us to be able to dedicate that capital to growth instead of reserving it for these other activities.
And since this is going to accelerate your ability to create jobs, I would think the timeline matters to the people who would be able to get hired as a result. Which brings me to my next question. Ms. Cross, it's my understanding that the SEC has been considering this at various levels and in various ways for some period of time. Do you have any sense for a time frame that you could give us by which the SEC would reach a decision about raising the shareholder limit?
I'd be happy to. As I noted in my testimony, when the limit was originally put in, it followed a robust study to understand the costs and the benefits and the economic consequences of a change in the rule. So we're doing that now. That takes time, I'm afraid. So I expect that we would get the work done on the study during 2012, and then the commission would, if they decide they want to change the rule, would need to put out a rule proposal. So it's at least, I'd have to say, more than a year away.
Okay, I just have to say that's disappointing. You know, I know this has been a subject of consideration and on the agenda of the SEC's Government Business Forum on Small Business Capital Formation for several years. And so if there's any way that that could move more quickly, that would be very helpful.
Well, I appreciate that, and to the extent that we're able to get information such as that provided by Mr. Geisen about the private company marketplace, that would really help. That's one of the things we're seeking right now. I think that's exactly the kind of information that we need.
Senator Shelby, I think, was engaged in a discussion about the cost of being a public company. If I remember correctly, I might have asked the question. I happen to have in front of me the number from the IPO task force suggesting that the average cost to go public is $2.5 million, and the annual cost to stay public on average is $1.5 million. I think this is for smaller new companies. And I'm just wondering, does that sound like I've got my figures right, Ms. Cross? Does that sound right to you?
I don't have data on the cost of IPOs. We are studying the IPO task force report now as well, and they're the kind of group from which we can get that data. So I would have to assume they're correct. I think the amounts vary, of course, according to the size of the company.
Right. Right. Last question I had is for Mr. Knight. In your testimony, you mentioned that the PCAOB's recent proposal to require public companies to rotate auditors, it's an example of a regulation that's not clearly necessary, but it certainly is costly. I share your concern, and I'm wondering if you could explain exactly why this is a very costly regulation for companies.
Well, there's a ramp-up cost involved with when you hire a new firm in this area. And so you spend that money, and then you're going to have to bring in and rotate another auditing firm and go through that same process again. When I take a step back and look at this, what it seems to me is an area where the PCAOB could focus more on is using their existing powers to oversee the accounting industry and not necessarily using them to, if you will, put more burdens on public companies. They have broad powers to regulate every aspect of accounting firms in this country. And that authority should be used more. We all want the highest financial standards, accounting standards possible. NASDAQ would not exist today without the accuracy and the reliability of financial disclosures. The accounting industry has a lot of challenges in front of it, including unlimited liability and other issues. But the direction of regulation is, it seems to me, too many times we turn to, well, let's add another requirement on public companies to deal with what I think is ultimately an issue of the accounting industry itself.
Thank you very much.
Senator Berkeley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your testimony.